Imagine it's midnight in medieval England. The streets are silent. The taverns have closed. Most people are asleep. But one man is just beginning his workday. A job so disgusting, so dangerous, that almost nobody else would do it. Yet without him, entire cities could collapse into disease and chaos. This man was known as a Gong Farmer, and he had one of the worst jobs in human history. When most people think about medieval Europe, they imagine magnificent castles, brave knights, and powerful kings. But the reality was very different. Most medieval cities were filthy. There were no modern sewer systems, no flushing toilets, no sanitation departments, and certainly no garbage trucks. Human waste had to go somewhere. For wealthy families, waste often ended up in underground pits beneath their homes. These pits were called privies. Over time, they filled with years of accumulated sewage. And eventually, someone had to empty them. That responsibility belonged to the Gong Farmer. The word gong didn't refer to a musical instrument. In medieval England, gong was actually slang for human waste, which means the title Gong Farmer literally translated to waste collector, a polite name for an incredibly unpleasant profession. But the reality was even worse than it sounds, because Gong Farmers didn't simply transport waste. They had to climb directly into cesspits. Imagine standing at the edge of a deep hole, a hole filled with years of rotting human waste. The smell alone would make most people vomit. Now imagine climbing inside, at night, with nothing but a shovel. That was a normal shift for a Gong Farmer. Hour after hour they scooped waste into buckets, then carried those buckets out by hand, again and again and again, until the pit was empty. The work was physically exhausting, but exhaustion wasn't the biggest danger. The real threat was invisible. Deep inside cesspits, dangerous gases accumulated over time. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, toxic fumes that could kill without warning. One breath could make a worker dizzy. Several breaths could make him unconscious. And if nobody noticed, he might never come back out. Historical records describe workers suffocating inside cesspits. Others drowned after losing consciousness and falling into the waste below. For Gong Farmers, every shift carried real risk. This wasn't just disgusting work. It was life-threatening work. And yet, people kept doing it. Why? Because surprisingly, it paid well. In medieval society, labor was cheap. Workers often struggled to survive. But Gong Farmers occupied a unique position. Nobody wanted the job, which meant cities had to offer higher wages. Supply and demand existed even 1,000 years ago. The fewer people willing to perform a task, the more valuable those workers became. As a result, experienced Gong Farmers often earned more than ordinary laborers. Some even managed to build modest savings. But money couldn't solve their biggest problem. Society hated them. People needed Gong Farmers, but they didn't want to be around them. The smell clung to their clothes, their skin, their tools, everything. Many communities treated them as social outcasts. Some towns required them to live on the outskirts of the city, away from everyone else. Children mocked them. Merchants avoided them. and many people refused to interact with them unless absolutely necessary. Imagine performing one of the most important jobs in society and being treated like you don't belong. That was everyday life for many Gong Farmers. Ironically, these workers were protecting public health. Without them, cesspits overflowed. Waste leaked into streets, contaminated water supplies, and increased the spread of disease. The cleaner a city remained, the less people thought about the workers responsible for keeping it clean. Success made Gong Farmers invisible. Failure made them essential. As cities grew larger, the demand for Gong Farmers increased. Places like London produced enormous amounts of waste. Thousands of people living close together created a sanitation problem unlike anything Europe had seen before. Authorities attempted regulations. Workers were assigned specific hours. Many Gong Farmers worked only at night, partly to reduce public exposure, and partly because nobody wanted to watch them work. The darkness became their workplace. While the city slept, they labored beneath it. Picture a cold winter night. The moon hidden behind clouds. A Gong Farmer pulling a heavy cart through silent streets. Most residents never see him. Most never thank him. Most pretend he doesn't exist. Yet by sunrise, another cesspit is empty. Another neighborhood is safer. Another day begins. Because someone did the work nobody else wanted. History celebrates kings, generals, explorers, but civilizations aren't built by famous people alone. They're built by ordinary workers performing extraordinary tasks. And few jobs were more important or more miserable than that of the Gong Farmer. But as strange as this profession sounds, the next medieval job might be even harder to believe, because people actually earned money collecting something every human produces daily, something so valuable that entire industries depended on it. Urine, and that's where our story goes next. Imagine walking through a medieval town carrying several wooden buckets. People stop and stare. Some laugh. Others wrinkle their noses in disgust. Yet despite the embarrassment, your cargo is surprisingly valuable. Not gold, not silver, not spices, urine, human urine. And in medieval Europe, it was worth money. Real money. Today, most people consider urine nothing more than waste. Something to flush away and forget. But in the Middle Ages, people viewed it differently, because urine contains something incredibly useful. Ammonia, a powerful chemical compound that craftsmen desperately needed. Long before factories existed, long before industrial chemistry, urine became one of the most important raw materials in Europe, which created an unusual profession, the urine collector. Every morning, urine collectors traveled through towns gathering supplies. Families often stored urine in containers rather than throwing it away. When collectors arrived, the contents were transferred into larger barrels. Imagine explaining this job to someone today. What's your profession? I collect pee. Sounds absurd. But centuries ago, it was perfectly normal. Entire industries depended on these workers. Without them, production would slow down. Businesses would lose money, and craftsmen would struggle to do their jobs. One of the biggest customers was the leather industry. Turning animal skin into usable leather wasn't easy. Fresh hides were tough, dirty, and difficult to process. Craftsmen discovered that urine helped loosen hair from animal skins. The ammonia softened materials and made leather easier to prepare. It wasn't pleasant, but it worked. Workers often stood in vats filled with urine while treating hides. Imagine spending your entire day ankle-deep in fermented human waste. Suddenly, modern workplaces don't seem so bad. The next time you admire a beautiful leather belt, a leather jacket, or a pair of handmade boots, remember that centuries ago, urine played a major role in creating them. And leather wasn't the only industry that relied on it. The textile trade needed it too. Medieval cloth makers faced a constant challenge, keeping fabrics clean and preparing them for dye. Before modern detergents existed, urine became a surprisingly effective cleaning agent. Workers soaked cloth in mixtures containing urine. The ammonia helped remove grease and dirt. Afterward, dyes bonded more effectively to the fabric. Bright colors, rich shades, luxury clothing. Many depended on a substance most people never wanted to think about. It's one of history's strangest examples of recycling. As demand increased, urine became a valuable commodity. Some towns established collection systems. Others created designated storage areas. The more manufacturing expanded, the more urine was needed. Think about that for a moment. An entire economy partially depended on people going to the bathroom. Every household became a tiny supplier. Every collector became part of an unusual supply chain. In some places, collectors earned respectable incomes, not because the work was glamorous, but because it was necessary. The medieval economy often rewarded usefulness over prestige. People might laugh at urine collectors, but businesses needed them, and businesses paid them. Yet money couldn't completely erase social stigma. Much like Gong Farmers, urine collectors occupied an awkward place in society. Their work was important, but people rarely admired it. Imagine attending a village festival. A blacksmith receives respect. A baker receives praise. A merchant receives attention. Meanwhile, everyone knows you're the person who spends the day transporting barrels of urine. Not exactly a prestigious reputation. Yet collectors continued working, because necessity always outweighs pride. And the challenges didn't stop with collection. Urine ages. As it sits, bacteria break it down. The smell becomes stronger, much stronger. Barrels had to be transported carefully. Storage required attention, and workers spent most days surrounded by odors that modern people would find unbearable. There were no air fresheners, no protective equipment, no modern sanitation, just determination and a strong stomach. What's fascinating is how ordinary people rarely considered where their materials came from. Customers bought leather shoes. They purchased colorful fabrics. They enjoyed finished products. Few thought about the strange supply chain behind them. The urine collector remained invisible, working quietly behind the scenes, helping industries function, helping economies grow, and receiving little recognition in return. History often focuses on kings and battles, but real life was powered by workers doing jobs nobody remembers. People willing to handle unpleasant tasks because society needed them. The urine collector wasn't glamorous, wasn't famous, and certainly wasn't respected. Yet without these workers, medieval manufacturing would have looked very different. They transformed waste into wealth, disgust into industry, and something most people ignored into a valuable resource. But if you think collecting urine sounds strange, the next profession was far more dangerous, because these workers hunted creatures that terrified entire cities, creatures blamed for disease, death, and disaster. Rats, thousands upon thousands of rats, and stopping them became someone's full-time job. Listen carefully. That scratching sound? In medieval Europe, it could mean trouble, serious trouble, because hidden beneath the floorboards, inside walls, and beneath crowded city streets, lived millions of unwanted residents, rats, and for centuries they were one of humanity's most feared enemies. Today, most people see a rat and quickly move on. Maybe it's unpleasant. Maybe it's annoying. But in the Middle Ages, a rat could trigger panic. Cities were overcrowded. Garbage filled the streets. Food was stored in wooden containers. Sanitation barely existed. For rats, it was paradise. They multiplied rapidly. 1 became 10. 10 became hundreds. Hundreds became thousands. Before long, entire neighborhoods could be overrun. The damage was enormous. Rats destroyed food supplies, contaminated water, ruined storage areas, and spread fear wherever they appeared. Imagine spending months growing crops, only to discover rats had eaten a large portion of your harvest. For many families, that could mean hunger, or worse, starvation. People desperately needed help. Someone had to control the infestation. Someone had to enter the darkest corners of the city. Someone willing to face thousands of aggressive rodents. That someone became known as the rat catcher. Rat catchers were specialists. Unlike ordinary workers, they understood rat behavior. They studied movement patterns. They learned where rats nested, and they developed techniques to eliminate them efficiently. In a world without modern pest control, these men became essential. Some relied on traps, simple but effective. Others used poison, though that often created new problems. Dead rats hidden inside walls produced horrific smells. Many rat catchers preferred a different solution. Dogs, specially trained hunting dogs, fast, aggressive, and incredibly skilled at killing rats. Certain breeds became famous for their ability to hunt rodents. These dogs could eliminate dozens of rats in minutes. Some became local legends. Entire crowds gathered to watch demonstrations. It sounds strange today, but medieval people were fascinated by skilled rat hunters, because every dead rat meant one less threat to their community. Then came the catastrophe that changed everything. The Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. Between 1347 and 1351, millions of people died. Entire villages disappeared. Cities lost huge portions of their populations. Fear spread faster than facts, and rats became public enemy number 1. For centuries, people associated rats with the plague. Many believed rodents were directly responsible for spreading disease. Modern historians continue debating the exact role rats played. But one thing is certain. Medieval people feared them, terrified them. The sight of rats often triggered panic, because where rats appeared, People expected death to follow Dot. Imagine entering a basement during a plague outbreak. Your torch flickers. The room is silent. Then suddenly, movement. Dozens of glowing eyes stare back from the darkness. A wave of rats rushes forward. This wasn't a nightmare. For some rat catchers, it was a normal workday. The profession wasn't without risks. Rat bites were common. Infections were common. Exposure to disease was constant. And the work itself could be physically exhausting. Hours spent crawling through filthy spaces, searching cellars, inspecting warehouses, checking grain stores, all while surrounded by rodents. Yet someone had to do it. When rat catchers succeeded, food supplies improved. Businesses suffered fewer losses. Communities felt safer. Their victories rarely made headlines. Nobody celebrated them like knights. Nobody wrote songs about them, but their contribution was real and incredibly important. Some rat catchers became highly respected experts. They passed techniques to apprentices, built reputations, and earned steady incomes. The best could identify infestations before others even noticed a problem. They understood their enemy better than anyone else, because survival often depended on it. Think about how strange that is. One person's entire career revolved around hunting rats, not for sport, not for entertainment, but because cities genuinely needed protection. It's another reminder that medieval life was far harsher than most people imagine. Behind every castle, behind every king, behind every famous battle, were ordinary workers solving extraordinary problems. And some problems were impossible to ignore, like death itself, because our next profession dealt with a challenge no one could escape. Not kings, not peasants, not warriors. Death came for everyone, and when it arrived, someone had to prepare the grave. In times of war, famine, and plague, one profession never ran out of work. And during humanity's darkest moments, these workers became more important than ever. Death was never far away. In the Middle Ages, a simple infection could kill. A bad harvest could kill. A war could kill. And when plague arrived, death came by the thousands. For most people, funerals were occasional events. For one profession, they were everyday life. These were the grave diggers, the men responsible for preparing humanity's final resting place. At first glance, grave digging might seem simple. Dig a hole, bury the body, move on. But medieval reality was far more brutal. Graves had to be dug entirely by hand. No machines, no excavators, no modern equipment. Just shovels, muscle, and endless hard labor. Imagine it's winter. The ground is frozen solid. The wind cuts through your clothes. Your hands ache from the cold. Yet a family is waiting. A burial must happen, and the grave isn't finished. So you keep digging, hour after hour, because death doesn't care about the weather. For grave diggers, physical exhaustion was only part of the job. The emotional burden was something else entirely. Every grave represented a human life, a father, a mother, a child, a friend, and some days there were far too many graves to count. Then came the Black Death, beginning in the mid-1300s. The plague swept across Europe with terrifying speed. Entire communities collapsed. Some villages lost half their population. Others vanished completely. The number of dead became overwhelming, and grave diggers suddenly faced an impossible task. In normal times, each person received an individual burial. But during major outbreaks, there wasn't enough time. There weren't enough workers, and there wasn't enough space. Mass graves became necessary. Large trenches were dug. Bodies were placed side by side, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds. A heartbreaking reality created by desperation. Imagine digging all day, only to learn another wagon full of bodies is arriving before you finish the first grave. That was life for many grave diggers during plague years. Some worked from sunrise until long after dark, day after day, week after week, with little rest, and no end in sight. The danger wasn't only emotional, it was physical. Most medieval people had little understanding of disease. Protective equipment didn't exist. Workers handled bodies directly, often without gloves, often without proper sanitation. Every burial carried risk. Every outbreak increased the danger. And yet they continued working, because somebody had to. Historical records tell stories of entire villages becoming eerily quiet. No laughter, no markets, no children playing, only church bells announcing another death, and another, and another. In those moments, grave diggers became some of the busiest people in Europe, not because they wanted the work, but because society depended on them. The profession often passed from one generation to the next. Skills were learned through experience. Where to dig, how deep, how to work efficiently, how to endure the emotional strain. Because sooner or later, every grave digger learned a difficult truth. You cannot do this job if you think about every burial too deeply. Many developed emotional distance, not because they lacked compassion, but because compassion alone couldn't carry them through hundreds of burials. The work demanded resilience, a willingness to face mortality every single day, to stand where others feared to stand, and continue working. Ironically, grave diggers rarely received recognition. Families mourned loved ones. Priests conducted ceremonies. Communities gathered to grieve. Yet the workers who made burial possible often remained invisible. Their labor happened behind the scenes, quietly, without applause, without celebration. History remembers kings. History remembers warriors. But during humanity's darkest moments, civilization also depended on people willing to do difficult, heartbreaking work. The grave digger was one of those people, a profession built on strength, endurance, and acceptance of a reality nobody can escape. Because in the Middle Ages, death was common, but life still had to continue. People still had jobs. Businesses still opened, and every morning workers still needed to wake up on time, which created one of history's strangest professions, a job that existed long before alarm clocks, long before smartphones, long before electricity, a job where your entire responsibility was making sure other people got out of bed. Imagine paying someone every morning just to knock on your window until you woke up. It sounds ridiculous today, but for centuries it was a real job. Imagine it's 4:30 in the morning. The streets are silent. The factories haven't opened. The sun hasn't risen, and somewhere inside hundreds of homes, people are fast asleep. But one worker is already awake, because if he doesn't do his job, dozens of people could lose theirs. His title? The Knocker Up. History's human alarm clock. Today, waking up is simple. Your phone rings. Your smartwatch vibrates. Your alarm clock buzzes. Problem solved. But for most of human history, none of those things existed. And during the Industrial Revolution and late medieval period, workers had a serious problem. Factories demanded punctuality. Employers expected workers to arrive on time. But reliable alarm clocks were rare and often expensive. So people found another solution. They hired a person every morning before sunrise. Knocker-ups walked through towns waking customers. Some used long bamboo poles. Others used wooden sticks. A few even carried pea shooters. Small tubes used to fire dried peas at bedroom windows. Anything that got attention without breaking the glass. The routine was simple. Arrive at the customer's home, knock on the window, and keep knocking until they woke up. Not until they moved. Not until they turned over in bed. Until they actually responded. Only then could the knocker-up move to the next customer. Imagine being responsible for 50 people, each with different schedules, different jobs, different waking times. One person needs to wake at 4:45, another at 5 o'clock, another at 5:15. One mistake could cause someone to miss work. And in an era when missing work often meant losing wages, that mistake mattered. Punctuality wasn't just convenience. It was survival. Many workers lived paycheck to paycheck. Being late could result in fines. Repeated lateness could mean unemployment, which meant knocker-ups carried enormous responsibility. Entire families depended on their reliability. The best knocker-ups developed impressive systems. Some memorized dozens of addresses. Others carried schedules written by hand. They knew exactly where to go, exactly when to arrive, and exactly how long to stay. In a strange way, they became living technology. Human machines performing a task that electronics would one day replace. And unlike modern alarms, they couldn't simply fail and restart. Rain didn't matter. Snow didn't matter. Cold weather didn't matter. If customers needed waking up, the knocker-up had to be there every morning, without exception. Imagine leaving your warm bed at 3:30 a.m. in freezing weather, just so someone else could leave theirs. That level of dedication is difficult to imagine today. As dawn approached, entire streets slowly came to life. Windows opened. Curtains moved. Workers prepared for another day. And most never thought about the person responsible for making it happen. The knocker-up remained in the background, always present, rarely noticed. Eventually technology caught up. Mechanical alarm clocks became cheaper, more reliable, more common, and slowly the demand for human alarm clocks disappeared. A profession that once served thousands of people began fading into history. One invention replaced an entire career, a reminder that even the most necessary jobs can vanish. Today, most people have never heard of knocker-ups. Their profession exists only in photographs and historical records. Yet for decades they performed a service millions depended on. Without electricity, without smartphones, without technology, just discipline, memory, and persistence. But as unusual as this profession sounds, the next job carried much greater danger, because one worker's breakfast could literally be his last. Imagine sitting beside a king. A feast is placed before you, the finest food in the kingdom, roasted meats, fresh bread, expensive wine. Everything looks perfect. Yet before the king takes a single bite, you must eat it first, because if the food contains poison, you're the one who dies. Welcome to the dangerous world of the royal food taster. For centuries, rulers feared assassination, and one profession existed for a single purpose: to die before the king did. NEXT. Imagine being invited to dine with a king. Golden plates, luxury foods, the finest wine in the kingdom. It sounds like a dream, until you realize one terrifying detail. You aren't there to enjoy the meal. You're there to find out if it's poisoned. And if it is, you'll be dead before the king takes his first bite. Welcome to one of history's most dangerous professions. The royal food taster. Power has always attracted enemies, and in the medieval world, assassination was a constant threat. Kings ruled vast territories, controlled enormous wealth, and made powerful enemies wherever they went. Some enemies carried swords. Others used something far more difficult to detect: poison. Poison offered a frightening advantage. No battlefield, no army, no warning. Just one meal, one drink, one mistake, and a ruler could be dead within hours. That possibility haunted medieval courts, so rulers developed a solution. Someone else would eat first. Before important meals, the food taster sampled dishes intended for the king: meat, bread, wine, desserts, everything. Only after waiting a period of time would the ruler begin eating. The logic was simple. If the taster became ill, the food was unsafe. If the taster survived, the king could proceed, at least in theory. Imagine the pressure. Every meal carried uncertainty. Every unfamiliar dish raised questions. Every unusual taste triggered concern. Was it spoiled? Was it harmless? Or was someone trying to commit murder? The taster rarely knew. All he could do was eat. And wait. History contains countless stories of poison plots. Some were real. Others may have been exaggerated over time, but the fear itself was very real. Royal courts were filled with political rivalries. Ambitious nobles, foreign agents, disgruntled rivals. Everyone wanted influence. Some wanted power, and occasionally, someone wanted the throne. This atmosphere created constant suspicion. A servant acting strangely, a cook making an unexpected mistake, a noble offering a gift. Anything could become a source of concern. For rulers, trust was a luxury, and food tasters became part of a larger security system designed to protect the crown. Ironically, food tasters often enjoyed access to incredible meals, foods most ordinary people could never afford. Rare meats, imported spices, expensive wines. For many peasants, such feasts were unimaginable, but privilege came with risk. A luxurious meal means little if it might kill you. Over time, some food tasters gained considerable trust. Kings saw them daily, shared private spaces with them, relied on them for protection. A loyal food taster could become an important member of the royal household. Not powerful, but respected, because every ruler understood one thing: this person was risking his life for theirs. And contrary to popular belief, tasting food wasn't always their only responsibility. Many monitored food preparation, observed kitchens, checked ingredients, and helped ensure meals were handled safely from start to finish. They became part detective, part security guard, part sacrificial shield, a strange combination of roles created by a dangerous world. What's fascinating is how fear shaped entire professions. Without the threat of poisoning, food tasters might never have existed. But medieval society was built on uncertainty. Wars, conspiracies, political intrigue. Danger lurked everywhere, and people adapted, sometimes in very unusual ways. Fortunately, most food tasters lived long lives. Actual poisoning attempts were relatively rare, but the possibility never disappeared. Every meal carried a question, and every bite represented trust. Trust in the cook, trust in the servants, trust in the people surrounding the throne. A trust that wasn't always deserved. The royal food taster reminds us that even the most glamorous places in history hid serious dangers. Behind the gold, behind the luxury, behind the power, there was fear. Fear of betrayal, fear of assassination, fear of the next meal. But while food tasters protected kings from poison, the next profession had a completely different responsibility. Its workers entertained royalty, made powerful rulers laugh, and occasionally spoke truth nobody else dared say. They wore bright colors, performed jokes, and lived lives balanced between privilege and danger. They were the Court Jesters, and their story is far stranger than most people realize. Making a king laugh sounds easy, but when your audience can order executions, every joke becomes a risk. Imagine entering a room filled with the most powerful people in the kingdom: generals, nobles, advisors, and at the center of it all, the king. Everyone is nervous. Everyone is careful. Everyone chooses their words wisely, except one person, a man dressed in bright colors, wearing a ridiculous hat with bells, making jokes in front of the most powerful ruler in the land. This was the Court Jester, and despite appearances, his job was far more dangerous than it looked. Most people imagine jesters as simple entertainers, funny costumes, silly jokes, harmless performances. But real court jesters were much more than that. They were comedians, storytellers, musicians, actors, and sometimes political advisors disguised as entertainers. A jester's primary responsibility was simple: keep the ruler entertained. That might sound easy, but imagine trying to make the same person laugh every single day, for years, without repeating yourself, without becoming boring, and while surrounded by constant pressure, because failure had consequences. Serious consequences. Kings weren't ordinary audiences. They controlled armies, made laws, declared wars, and in some cases, held absolute power over life and death. If a ruler enjoyed your performance, life was good. If he didn't, things could become very uncomfortable, very quickly. Yet court jesters possessed something unique, a rare privilege denied to almost everyone else. They could sometimes speak honestly to the king. While nobles carefully chose their words, jesters could hide criticism inside humor. A joke could reveal uncomfortable truths. A funny story could expose bad decisions. And because it was comedy, the king might actually listen. Think about how unusual that is. In a world where criticizing a ruler could be dangerous, the jester often became the one person allowed to say what others could not. Not because he was powerful, but because humor gave him protection. At least most of the time, the best jesters were incredibly talented. They sang songs, played instruments, performed acrobatics, told stories, memorized jokes, and adapted performances to match the mood of the court. In many ways, they were medieval celebrities. Everyone knew who they were. Everyone recognized them, and everyone waited to see what they would do next. But life wasn't always glamorous. Being funny for a living is exhausting, especially when your audience expects constant entertainment. Imagine waking up every morning knowing your job depends entirely on making someone smile. No laughter, no success, no security, and sometimes no future. Some jesters became trusted companions. They traveled with rulers, shared meals, attended important events. A few even influenced political decisions, not through authority, but through trust. When a king laughs with someone every day, a unique relationship forms, and occasionally that relationship gave jesters unexpected influence. History remembers several famous court jesters. Some became legends, others entered folklore. Their names survived centuries because they brought something rare into royal courts. Humor, a reminder that even kings needed laughter. Even rulers needed entertainment. Even powerful people needed moments of joy. But despite their colorful clothing and cheerful performances, jesters lived with uncertainty. Their status depended on the ruler's favor. One bad joke, one mistake, one misunderstanding, and everything could change. Their lives balanced between privilege and risk, between fame and vulnerability. A delicate balance few people could maintain. The court jester teaches us something fascinating about history. Sometimes the people who appear least important have the most interesting stories. Behind every joke was intelligence. Behind every performance was strategy. And behind every laugh was a worker trying to survive in a world ruled by powerful people. But if you think the court jester had a strange profession, the next job may be the most shocking of all, because these workers believed they could remove a dead person's sins by eating food placed on their corpse. It sounds unbelievable, yet for centuries people genuinely believed it worked. Welcome to the mysterious world of the Sin Eater. When someone died, a mysterious figure would arrive at the house. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a doctor. And what happened next would seem horrifying to modern audiences. Imagine you've just lost a loved one. The family is grieving. The house is silent. Candles flicker in the darkness. And then a stranger arrives at the door. not a priest, not a doctor, not a friend, a stranger, a man with a job so unusual that it sounds more like folklore than history. Yet for centuries people believed his work was real. They called him the Sin Eater. The Sin Eater's role was tied to one of humanity's oldest fears. What happens after death? Many medieval communities believed that when a person died, some of their sins remained attached to their soul. Unforgiven mistakes, hidden regrets, wrongdoings never confessed. These sins could prevent a peaceful journey into the afterlife, and that terrified people, because in deeply religious societies, eternity mattered. A lot. Visual, a piece of bread placed on the chest of the deceased. Narrator, GID. According to local tradition, a piece of bread would be placed on the chest of the dead person. Sometimes it was bread. Sometimes it included ale or wine. The belief was simple. The food would absorb the sins of the deceased. Then the sin eater would consume it, taking those sins upon himself, so the dead could move on with a clean soul. Think about that for a moment. Your profession is to symbolically inherit the sins of strangers. Not once, not twice, but over and over again. Every funeral, every death, every grieving family, you become the person society turns to when they fear the soul of a loved. One may not find peace. It's one of the strangest occupations ever recorded. Visual. Villagers watching the sin eater from a distance. Narrator. Ironically, despite performing what many considered an important service, sin eaters were often treated as outsiders. People feared them, avoided them, whispered about them. Why? Because if you spend years absorbing the sins of the dead, what does that make you? At least in the minds of superstitious villagers. Many believed sin eaters carried spiritual burdens, that they were somehow contaminated by the countless sins they supposedly collected. As a result, many lived lonely lives. Few enjoyed social status. Few received respect. And while families welcomed them during times of grief, that welcome often disappeared once the ritual ended. The same people who needed them frequently avoided them afterward. Visual. Medieval church and villagers praying. Narrator. It's important to understand that sin eating was never an official church practice. Religious authorities often disapproved of it. Many priests considered the tradition superstition. Yet beliefs don't disappear simply because authorities reject them, especially during uncertain times. People wanted comfort. People wanted reassurance, and the sin eater offered both. Whether the ritual worked or not wasn't always the point. Believing it worked was enough. The payment was usually modest. A few coins, a meal, some bread, perhaps a drink. Nobody became wealthy as a sin eater. The profession existed on the edges of society, neither fully accepted nor completely rejected. A strange middle ground occupied by a handful of individuals willing to perform a role others avoided. What makes the story fascinating isn't whether the ritual actually removed sins. Modern audiences don't need to believe it did. What's fascinating is why people believed it. The tradition reveals something timeless about human nature, our desire for closure, our fear of the unknown, our hope that loved ones find peace after death. These emotions are universal. They connect us to people who lived hundreds of years ago. even if their solutions seem unusual today. Imagine carrying the reputation of a man who consumes the sins of the dead. Imagine the rumors, the stories, the fear. Some communities viewed sin eaters almost like cursed figures, necessary but unsettling, respected but isolated, a living reminder of mortality. And mortality made many people uncomfortable, whether viewed as spiritual helpers, misunderstood outcasts, or simply products of a superstitious age. Sin eaters remain one of history's most unforgettable professions, a job born from fear, sustained by belief, and remembered because it seems almost impossible to imagine today. But our journey through weird medieval jobs isn't over yet, because the final profession became one of the most recognizable images in history. A figure wearing a black coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and a terrifying bird-like mask. A person whose appearance alone could cause panic, because wherever they appeared, death was usually nearby. End of chapter 8. Transition. The beaked mask has become one of history's most famous symbols. But few people know the truth behind the men who wore it. The payment was usually modest. A few coins, a meal, some bread, perhaps a drink. Nobody became wealthy as a sin eater. The profession existed on the edges of society, neither fully accepted nor completely rejected. A strange middle ground occupied by a handful of individuals willing to perform a role others avoided. What makes the story fascinating isn't whether the ritual actually removed sins. Modern audiences don't need to believe it did. What's fascinating is why people believed it. The tradition reveals something timeless about human nature, our desire for closure, our fear of the unknown, our hope that loved ones find peace after death. These emotions are universal. They connect us to people who lived hundreds of years ago, even if their solutions seem unusual today. Imagine carrying the reputation of a man who consumes the sins of the dead. Imagine the rumors, the stories, the fear. Some communities viewed sin eaters almost like cursed figures, necessary but unsettling, respected but isolated, a living reminder of mortality. And mortality made many people uncomfortable, whether viewed as spiritual helpers, misunderstood outcasts, or simply products of a superstitious age. Sin eaters remain one of history's most unforgettable professions, a job born from fear, sustained by belief, and remembered because it seems almost impossible to imagine today. But our journey through weird medieval jobs isn't over yet, because the final profession became one of the most recognizable images in history. A figure wearing a black coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and a terrifying bird-like mask. A person whose appearance alone could cause panic, because wherever they appeared, death was usually nearby. End of chapter 8. Transition. The beaked mask has become one of history's most famous symbols. But few people know the truth behind the men who wore it.